Remind you, I'm going to record this. I think it's handy for anybody who may not make it. We are missing about 4 people. So Rick, if you can keep an eye on the participants that might be waiting as I get the film ready. And we're going to run this pretty similar to last week. We're going to watch the film. This one's about 10 minutes. We're going to talk. I have like a little summary of what he said, and then we will break into smaller groups. So
I do have to say the recording was really good because I watched it this afternoon. So I'm right
good.
up
I'm
to
glad.
speed.
It kind of gets you in that mode. So
Right.
Rick did such a great job introducing us last time to our film person. So take it away.
Okay, well, the important thing to know about Walter Brueggemann is that he's a Nebraskan, northeast Nebraska, almost 90 years ago. Time flies, time flies. He is one of North America's and one of the world's most important scholars on the Old Testament. Yeah. And he is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, which I had not known until I looked him up this afternoon. Yeah. His major scholarly approach is called rhetorical criticism, which is, as the name suggests, an approach to the biblical text that focuses on the ways that human authors and redactors attempt to influence the directions of thought and action of their readers. And I think that the little film excerpt, the interview excerpt that we'll be seeing this evening, really speaks very much to the way that we as readers of the Bible are expected or are hoped to put into action the words of the text.
Okay, here we go.
My thought about addressing something to the North American church is that the gospel has gotten all tangled up with a sense of Western white entitlement, which in the United States particularly has to do with a history of political exceptionalism in which we've come to think that we're God's chosen people in the world. And I think one of the primary tasks of the church in North America now is to pull apart that sense of Western white exceptionalism from the gospel, because I think they've become confused and intertwined. And if those can be pulled apart by doing some critical theological thought, then it seems to me that the church would be in a much better position to speak critically to our culture. And so I think that's a very hard thing, because my experience in the church is that people do not want white Western exceptionalism separated from the gospel, and we tend to think of it all as a single package. But if the church can position itself critically over against that culture, then it seems to me that you could identify 3 tasks that the church needs to work at. The first task is that the church, if it gets unencumbered about that, needs to be a truth teller, needs to tell the truth about our society that has become increasingly exploitative and abusive and violent in not only in our practices, but in very much of our socioeconomic political policy. And we've kind of fallen into that and have not reflected on how damaging that is to vulnerable people in our society. The second task that I think the church can undertake much better if it has some critical distance from dominant culture is that it can teach and witness to and act out an alternative way in the world. And I incline to think that one can easily identify probably 3 practices that would be genuinely alternative. One of those is hospitality of welcoming people who are unlike us. And obviously, at least in the United States now, we are a very unwelcoming culture if one thinks, for example, of Muslims, and the task of practicing hospitality to people who are unlike us is an urgent task. The second task that can be undertaken is generosity, and in a world of frightened capitalism, there really is no impetus for generosity, and we tend to treat the public good with parsimony rather than generosity. And the third task to which the church can bear witness is the task of forgiveness, which means breaking the vicious cycles of resentment and vengeance, which are very powerful in our society. More and more as the church gets freed of the dominant ideology of our society, which I characterize as military consumerism, the church could be much freer to undertake its most authentic mode of life in terms of hospitality and generosity and forgiveness. The third task that the church then can undertake is not only to act out those practices in its own neighborly relationships, but to be at work in shaping public attitudes and public policy, because there isn't any reason that these North American societies cannot take on more neighborly practices that are gentle and kind and compassionate, and that are committed to social justice for all of our citizens and all of our members who are present among us. When I ask about how the church can position itself to undertake these subversive tasks, it is clear that the church cannot do that as long as it participates in the fearful anxiety that seems now to compel our society. I believe that the selfishness and the parsimony and the exclusionary practices of our society are all grounded in a deep and amorphous anxiety, and the church is easily seduced into practicing that. So when I ask, how can the church disengage from that kind of widespread anxiety, the first answer that I would give is that the church needs to be practicing Sabbath. And we have that to learn from Judaism, because Sabbath is really the practice of breaking the vicious cycle of production and consumption that leaves us restless and dissatisfied, and to position ourselves rather on the receiving end of the gift of life, rather on the end of always taking initiative and seeking to control. So I think what the North American church now has to work at is to recover its own authentic message and its own authentic practice of social relationships that I believe are in profound tension with the dominant relationships of our society. As I thought about this matter, I thought about the crisis of the German church during National Socialism and the rise of Hitler. The predominant attitude of German Christians was that they did not need to choose between Hitler's National Socialism and the Christian gospel. They tried to hold those together, and the phrase that was fashioned to describe that were the Deutsche Christi, the German Christians who saw no tension between their particular Germanness and the gospel. And that's where Bonhoeffer's phrase comes from, cheap grace. Cheap grace was not a generic phrase, but it was a phrase applied to Germans who thought they did not have to choose in terms of the gospel or national ideology. Now it seems to me that in the North American church, and particularly in the United States, we have arrived at that kind of cheap grace in which we have thought that we have not had to choose between the gospel of hospitality and generosity and forgiveness on the one hand and military consumerism on the other hand. And I think now we are seeing more clearly than we did a few years ago that we really have some very important decisions to make in terms of sorting this out. And those are my thoughts. I do live in hope. I think the Spirit is stirring in the church, and I expect that the church is going to be undertaking these tasks in what I hope will be very courageous ways. So I do live in hope.
Okay, I think that he gave us quite a bit to think about there. And I did want to share briefly kind of a little bit of a recap. Oops, hold on, we're rolling. We're practically into next week. Okay, let me pull up that. This gives us a little bit of an overview to what he feels that the church should be doing. You guys can see that?
Yeah, I have people's faces in the way. How do I get rid of that?
You can put your cursor on the edge and drag them over to one side or the other. You know, in the same way you would resize any window.
Yeah. Okay, let me see.
Or
Okay.
you can,
Good,
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, you can also just go up and click on view and say like side by side gallery or something, and that kind of moves them over too.
yeah. And we're just going to look at this for about a minute. What he was talking about here is that the church needs to be truth tellers. And I think that means, you know, acknowledging where we are and that this Western white attitude is a very real thing. Then he talks about the church needs to teach, witness to, and seek out alternative ways of doing things. And he suggests doing that through hospitality, generosity, and forgiveness. And it's interesting how he speaks to the fact that churches are not hospitable. This is something that might come up at your groups, how you feel about that. And generosity, which he says is not something that the church is very good at either. Forgiveness, of course, is trying to break the cycle of vengeance and resentment. And he talks about all of that he calls military consumerism. This notion that we're constantly scrambling to get the next thing. And then finally, he talks about the third thing churches should do, which is to shape public attitude and public policy through neighborly practices. And we just spent an entire year talking about being neighbors. And by practicing Sabbath, and that is a question that we're definitely going to talk about when we get into our groups.
Yeah.
So there is probably a lot more in what he said in that 10-minute piece, but I think that these will give us some directions to think about when we break into groups. Okay, is it gelling with people?
Mhm, yeah.
Okay. Let me see how we're going to break these groups out. Take me a minute. Try to break them up a little bit from last time. Rick, if you had anything that you wanted to add to the conversation while I'm
Eager to get into the groups.
okay. Sandy. Ching Fen. Maybe that is good because we don't have quite everybody. So some of you will have an invitation pop up on your screen. And before I hit go to the rooms, we're going to try to pick one person to be a spokesman. So when we come back together, we can do a little bit of sharing and we'll kind of know who should talk. Okay? Now, how come it's not going? Okay, you're all there?
Looks
Not
like
yet.
it's going.
Ching Fen, you should be going off to the other group. Did he go?
I think he's going.
Oh, Amy, you should have an invitation on your screen to go.
I'm supposed to be in room 1.
So
Yeah.
click on OK
Yeah,
Oh.
click okay.
or accept or go there, or whatever it says.
Join.
Join.
There
she
we
is.
go.
It's beamed
Okay.
up.
Yep. She got beamed up.
Beamed up. I know, it's always exciting. So I'm going to open the chat here now and put the questions in there like I did last time. I don't like to block everybody off by putting in a big thing. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about just real briefly is the notion of story and the notion also of telling our truth. And I think an important thing to remember in this whole, like, how did Christianity get to be this Western white culture? And we can trace a lot of this all the way back to 313 when Constantine suddenly decided that, yes, we're going to make Christianity the state religion. Okay, prior to that, Christians were practicing, they were oppressed, so they were really seeking out people who were poor and people who were set upon and that kind of thing. And then as soon as they became the chosen religion of the power people, now they are the power people. And there is a tendency to align your thoughts with that group that is now supporting your power. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as we work through some of these questions and think about what that all means in terms of trying to break it apart. It's 313 was a pretty long time ago. And even though there were some groups, obviously, who weren't down with that sort of thing, and this is how we get Catholics and Mormons and other groups of white Christians who came to this country. And then it did eventually sort of perpetuate itself again. So the first question that I thought we would talk about a little bit here is, how does Sabbath contribute to breaking this cycle he's talking about of production and consumption? How are we practicing it? Are we practicing it? What is it?
I don't think we're practicing it as much as we should and as much as we used to. Um, I think that for the most Christian churches, breaking the Sabbath is going to church for an hour and 15 minutes a Sunday. It's kind of what we think of breaking the Sabbath right now. Where in the when I grew up in Chicago, where there were a lot of Dutch Reformed churches, where they really did not do anything on the Sabbath other than go to church. So I don't know if that's where you're getting at, but that's, you didn't mow your lawn, you didn't do anything. You went to church in the morning, you went to church in the evening, and you just hung around. And and like stores were closed. Well, look at Paramus. Paramus is still not breaking the Sabbath. Paramus is still not there. So I don't know if that's what we're doing, but that's what you're thinking of. But that's my thought about it.
Well, I think it's true that a lot of busyness and life activities have encroached on that one day a week that we were originally supposed to be holding outside of those kinds of activities. So I think I agree with you, Karen, that we don't get to practice it much. But I will say that sometimes, it is, Sunday always does feel a little different to me. And I cherish that. Sometimes we'll take a walk, or sometimes we'll, besides going to church, we'll do some activity that we wouldn't have otherwise done, and we will set aside chores and stuff like that to do it. And of course, that doesn't always have to happen on a Sunday either. I guess you can practice Sabbath on any day of the week.
So I'm kind of intrigued by this notion of Sabbath, or I guess the question I'm asking myself then is, what is Sabbath, and what is it intended to be, right? I mean, yes, part of it for us is going to church, but more abstractly, I think of it as pausing for reflection. And then I think, well, that's kind of that's a good practice. That's a secular practice, a reflective, a meditative practice. But what does that mean for us as Christians? Partially to praise God, partially to express gratitude, and then the question is, well, so how, and if you're doing that, then you're focused on God, not on consumption, right? What am I going to do next that's enjoyable to me? Or, how am I going to get ahead of the work week, or those. And I agree, it doesn't have to be Sunday. Part of when we were doing the daily prayer groups at noon, and now even, doing them twice a week, to me, that's a little bit of Sabbath, because it stops me in the middle of the day when I am usually quite, involved in things, and just creates that space. And that's part of Sabbath.
Yeah, I think we can, remember from our commandment, the third commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And I think we probably all have a notion of our Jewish brothers and sisters who are truly practicing Sabbath to the point where they do no work at all. My mother just got a new oven that comes with a Sabbath setting so that it can automatically cook the food without her having to touch it. Of course, she didn't rig that up, but that's taking it to an extreme. But practicing Sabbath is, I think, that notion that we are to be more focused on God and less on these things that contribute to production and consumption. And it's hard to do because
It is hard, especially with some people that work all week, 10 hours a day. And Saturday they kind of collapse, and then Sunday they try to get everything that they wanted, that they didn't get done for their home or themselves. They try to cram that into the Saturday or Sunday, where they're just cramming other things in that they couldn't personally do because they're working 50 hours a week. So, we should really keep the Sabbath more, I think, for mental health and physical health and spiritual health.
I think Mike's right that it doesn't necessarily have to happen on a Sunday. That might be an ancient thing that we can't, put that genie back in the bottle, because if people have only a Sunday where they have to do their grocery shopping, then that's what they have to do. But can you think of any ways to encourage people to spend more time reflecting rather than doing? Is there any way to help people do that?
So I'm wondering a little bit, does Sabbath, does it necessarily involve a community? I mean, can you really, because I think what Mike said at the beginning is really critical for a lot of people nowadays. Like, Sunday is not a rest day. I mean, if Monday is a packed day, you simply cannot afford to take Sunday off and say, I'm going to church, I'm going to do all this other stuff, because then Monday comes and you're not ready. So then I'm thinking, if you say, well, I'm going to do Sabbath on Thursday, but then none of your community is available on Thursday. So how does that change Sabbath? I mean, is Sabbath supposed to be just between you and your God? Or is it supposed to have an aspect of family, whether that's physical family or church family or whatever? That's just a question. Sorry, that's not very hopeful.
No, that's an
I'm
interesting
not
question.
sure there's a hard and fast answer to that.
I like the question though.
And I have actually talked and taught Sabbath moments for families with young kids quite a few times. And there are lots of people that have written books on how families with young kids can practice Sabbath. And they say, hey, 10 minutes. If all you can get is 10 minutes on a Saturday to stop doing, to, be together as family and take a walk outside. And also, while you're walking outside, acknowledging this is God's creation. I think Sabbath is about God. And if you are spending time with God, then you are not spending time making the next dollar.
What does the word actually mean? I assume it's Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't actually know.
I don't know. I would have to Google
I
that.
should look it up. I can
It's
Google
the
it too.
kind
Don't
of
worry.
word
Don't worry.
that
I
you
don't
feel.
know. I always think of Gerald as being able to
That's
enlighten
true.
us on these things.
It's the kind of word that you feel like you know what it
No?
means, but then you get like, well, maybe I need to look it up.
I mean, I have to confess, I teach the witches Sabbath. So, I mean, that's the other sort of connotation that I have. So I'm like, what is it? I should have looked this up. I really should know this.
And are they taking a break from it? I think it means taking a
They're
break from it.
gathering. They're
Oh, they're
gathering
gathering.
together. It's the community
Gerald
aspect.
has
That's
a-
why I was wondering. Oh, sorry, Gerald. I'd be
I
quiet.
think it simply means the seventh day.
Seventh
I-
day.
Yeah, I actually don't know, but I think it simply means the seventh day.
Hmm.
And I think what the idea is, it's not just for you, but for God, it's also for you, because actually, God is in you, you are in God, you're the image of God. So I think in the Hebrew sense, I mean, in the Hebrew scriptures, it was definitely a community thing, and people not doing any work. And it had to be in a community because everything was done together. I mean, everything was much more cooperative than today. So I actually don't know the significance. That's what I would guess the meaning is in Hebrew.
Brueggemann did say one thing in the film that sort of might give us a little clue. He said that it's a time to be on the receiving end instead of always being the doer.
Good.
Okay, let's take a look at this next question. How does the Christian church often choose between the gospel and nationalism, or between the gospel and military consumerism?
So I did research it. It seems to mean rest, Sabbath.
Sabbath, okay.
Yeah, but yeah. But the first time it's used, it's in reference to the seventh day. The first time it's used in the Bible. So anyway.
Okay. So what about this notion of military consumerism? How are we choosing that over what the gospel tells us?
I don't know if this is, I think this might be a distraction, but I wasn't entirely sure that I understood what the phrase refers to, military consumerism.
Oh, it means in the US represents 4% of the world and produces 70% of the military weapons that are used in the world. And out of that comes most of the wealth of the United States from military power and from military research and from military production. We spend more money on military power than I think the next 7 countries combined.
Yep.
Even though they have much more population than we do. And that's part of why we're rich, because not only we make all these weapons, but we're the #1 seller of military weapons in the world, which is part of, a lot of what you see selling to Saudi Arabia, selling to all these places that actually we wouldn't get along all that well with.
Suddenly your volume went down some, but I did hear everything you said there. Thank you. Okay, it is more literal. I was just confused that it might be some sort of metaphor that I was missing.
I think a part of it is a little bit metaphorical in that this military consumerism that we support is giving us this notion, this promise of safety and happiness.
Instead of seeking not just those things, but seeking other forms of equanimity through the gospel.
Or justice.
Or instead of seeking justice, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of Switzerland. You're not going to be able to defend yourself against anybody else, right? And yet they managed to stay independent, honestly, in the Middle Ages, they were actually quite good soldiers. Nobody wanted to fight with the Swiss, but you know, we're in a different position because of our weapons, you know, um, because of our military strength. And if we chose not to invest in that, we would have to behave very differently in the world.
Mhm. But we would also, I think, to Catherine's point, I could call her Kathy. You have to call her Catherine. To her point, I'm sorry. That if we didn't spend our money on those military things, we would also have more money to apply to more, justice issues. I think that's a
To healthcare, to education, to whatever.
Well, and I think military and nationalism are tied up here. It's not just the money, it's the nationalistic jingoism.
Yeah.
And I mean, as we discussed last week, right? Allegiance to, to country, which is essentially in conflict with the gospel, right? Well, isn't that what we were talking about last week?
absolutely
Yes,
yes.
absolutely. Good memory.
Yeah, but I think in the U.S., many churches are really consider patriotism to be a big thing, and God has chosen America, all of the things around American exceptionalism that with the city on the hill that we're like the Israelis. We were the Israelites. We were supposed to come in and wipe out the Native Americans, just like the Israelites wiped out the Canaanites. I mean, that's what a lot of churches and Republican politicians believe.
We're founded on,
Right?
Christian principles.
It just we're kind of the second coming of Israel.
It's a little hard for me to hear.
Yeah,
I
I don't know
know.
if the microphone is too far from you, Gerald. I mean, I'm getting it, but if
I'm
I don't,
getting- if you could get closer and speak a little louder, it would help. Yeah, maybe because you're far. Yeah.
I think we caught that. So
Maybe I should do that.
yeah, I mean, it's a real problem in our country. I think that, and I don't know that it isn't a problem elsewhere, but it certainly seems like a growing problem here. The mixing up of things like patriotism, nationalism, what you will, with our religious culture. It does seem to confuse values. I'm stepping carefully.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I feel like I'm echoing somewhere.
Sometimes you echo and other times you're fine.
So I think as we were watching the film and he brought up some of the other points about how churches can teach and witness, and he talked about hospitality, generosity, and forgiveness. Were there things that jumped to your mind about our church, about Union Congregational Church? He kind of made this broad brush statement that churches are not hospitable. And he went on to explain that in such a way that, we are not welcoming the other in a way that we should. And I think we oftentimes speak about our church, about Union Cong, as being welcoming. Do you think that that's true?
Yeah, I do. I think we're welcoming. I don't. That doesn't mean we're perfect, and it also doesn't mean that we are very proactive, but I think that if someone walks through our doors, we're pretty welcoming. There's lots more we could do.
I know we're not attracting the minority people that much. Not that we're not welcoming them, but we're not attracting. So I think if they were there, if they entered the church and were there, we would welcome them. But I don't think we're doing a lot of things to help the minorities come.
Well, I think welcoming,
Not that we're not welcoming those people.
I mean, again, I think it kind of goes in a way to how we want to think about welcoming. If welcoming is defined as friendliness, well, then we're we're definitely a friendly crew. Most of the time. I mean, yeah, people stand around and talk with some of the people they know, blah, blah, blah. But I think I interpret Brueggemann as speaking more broadly, which is to think explicitly about how our practices are really pretty imbued with white norms, and not just white norms, but Northern European norms, and our music and our decor and our stained glass, and so that it doesn't feel that it perhaps feels foreign from a cultural perspective to a lot of different folk. So I think it's when I've started to think of welcoming as a much broader concept than simply, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but then, we tend to talk about it in terms of greeting. Do we greet people? But I think it's broader than that.
Yeah. And I have to say that for our church, there have been a couple of practices that we have started, there are two things I think we have done recently that are addressing these very notions that he talks about. And one of them is, Catherine, I can't remember the name of this investing team that was put into place to sort of broaden our horizons on where we put our money, and
the direct investment task force.
Yes. And so we wanted to see if we could get our money out of guns and tobacco and invest it in environmental or neighborhoods. And so that's something that we took on, and that team continues to investigate that. And another team that is about to be put into place is the Racial Justice Task Force, because we just can't get enough task forces. And that's going to take all of this work, all of this racial work that we have done, all of the books that we've read and the conversations we had, and everybody's attending America to Me. And now we're going to have this task force that is going to look at exactly those things that you mentioned, Catherine. It's not just what we say and how we greet people that may happen to come into our building, but are we really welcoming when they get there? Will they find a familiar feel? So those are some things that our church may be working on, but I think that Brueggemann was also speaking more broadly about church in general. They still say that it's the most segregated hour in the country on Sunday morning because people are in their little bubble of sameness for the most part. So one of the ways that he talked about too of trying to figure out how to be better, how to accomplish some of these tasks of hospitality, generosity, and forgiveness is to ask ourselves, not just ourselves, but if you see these next four questions, the what, you can ask these questions to in a church gathering. What are the concerns of the world? You know, if you want to try to affect some change and break the chain that we're talking about here, what are the concerns of the world? And we can come up with answers. What kind of answers might you get in a church gathering about what are the concerns of the world?
I think one would be war and being against people because of their different beliefs and trying to be over people that you don't believe like you. I think war isn't going on all the time. One group over another. That's one thing.
Mm-hmm. Other concerns?
Well, I would assume poverty would be in there.
Yeah.
And inequality, poverty, inequality, war, disease, lack of medical health. Racism.
Yeah, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Also,
Refugees.
the allocation of resources, because it so much affects a lot of those other issues. You know, it is partially what causes wars. It's partially to do with how healthcare is available and distributed, and food
And-
is available and distributed.
And so as we step that down to the smaller group, what are the concerns of your local community? I think some of the things we just mentioned are concerns in the community. Are there others concerns in our community?
I think the environment is another great concern of the world.
Yeah.
And it goes from the world right down to country, state, city, township, or whatever.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
How we create others, how we, I mean, I'm thinking, I mean, it gets at the neighborliness or lack thereof, right? But how we treat the stranger, quote unquote.
So what would neighborliness? Is that what you're talking about? How about housing?
Sure.
Yeah.
A lot of this is really our statement of purpose, right?
Kind of is, isn't it?
Oh, education. That's a big one. That's big.
Equal
Local.
education.
It tends to be a community concern.
Yes, always. How about concerns of the local church community?
Oh, I thought that's the question we were on.
Oh, I don't think we've gotten to the local church community quite yet.
The local community and the local church community, it starts to blend though. But I think you're right. There could be more.
Well, I mean, if we were just talking, I mean, specifically to the local church, then the concern might be that we are too homogenous in our makeup. I mean, that seems to be something that is coming up.
Good point.
Well, and I think if I just look at all of this and think a little, I mean, what Bruggeman's saying to me is that we need to look outward, that the church is if you paint this broad brush, is insular, right? I mean, he's calling us to get out of ourselves, right? I mean, Sabbath is about resting, yes, but also that relationship with community, with God, with taking that pause in your own and furthering your own self-interest. And hospitality and generosity and forgiveness are all outward facing.
Mhm.
And even the white exceptionalism is I mean, the exceptionalism is very much it's very ego driven.
I don't know if others have this reaction, but as I think of these concentric circles or whatever, as we get closer, as we move from world to, say, country to community to church community, it's hard, if I'm being honest, it's hard not to recognize as well that some of our concerns become more parochial, right? Is the roof going to need repair in the next 10 years? Are they going to raise my taxes? Oh my God. That kind of thing is a concern and I think it's more of a concern the more locally you cast your lens or whatever, you place your lens. And I was hearing some of the Brueggemann talk, and this is sort of echoing what you were saying, Kath, but some of it was asking us to ponder, how do we move outward from those parochial concerns? Or I feel like it could be asking us that anyway.
Yeah, that is kind of the big question there. I think we're going to try to get back into our larger group to share some of this. We did not assign a spokesperson, or is there somebody that feels like they can speak to the group and sort of recap what we've talked about?
You guys will jump in and tell me where I missed the mark. I will do it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to get us back together and we'll see what they discussed on their end. The other point, oops, I think I'm running out of power. The other point that Brueggemann made in terms of these questions is, it's one thing to be sitting around a church conference table and asking those questions of our group, and you should always go to the group, go to the community and ask them, what are your concerns? It may be very different than what we assume are their concerns. So
fair point.
the subtitle of this unit is Citizenship as Hospitality. There are lots of subtitles in this.
You're gonna keep the questions up there. Does that stay with us?
I don't
Betsy?
think that chat stays. I can put them in the other group chat.
Well, when
No,
they
actually,
come back in,
it probably
it'll
does
be
if
here.
we're in the main room. It's our chat.
I think it will, because I
Will.
asked a question earlier and it's still there, like before
Yeah.
we started. So yeah, I think because we're in the main room, yeah.
Okay. They must be really deep in conversation. They're not coming back.
We're waiting for you to pull them. There they are.
Here they come.
They're coming back.
We're back.
Hi there. You guys
Hey.
must have been deep in conversation.
We were. It's hard not to be.
Can you still see the questions that I put up in the chat? Can you see this chat room?
I cannot. What I might do is copy them into the actual chat box. How would that be?
I think they're in the chat box.
They're in my
are.
chat box, but I can
I think this happened last time that for some reason the breakout room didn't see things that were put in the chat even to everyone while
about
they
now?
were away.
Yes, got them. Thank you.
Okay.
There it is.
Yeah, because we did talk about the same questions this time. So I thought maybe, I hope you chose a spokesman. We forgot, but Catherine said she'll give it a shot. But can you share some of your reflections about Sabbath and?
Well, I'm afraid that that I was sort of volunteered to be the spokesman.
Perfect.
But yeah, that's exactly what we wound up spending most of our time on, right? Everybody was Sabbath, how it works in practice, whether Sabbath is a solitary pursuit or a social pursuit, how we can take the notion of shared communal Sabbath and translate that somehow into this disruption, this subversion of the dominant culture that Brueggemann talks about. We did not come up with an answer to the question of how Sabbath.
We were counting on you.
And yeah, I know, we were counting on you. We did not come up with an answer to the question of how we can use the experience of Sabbath to put pressure on public attitudes and public policies, which seems to me the most important step, and obviously the most difficult step. Everybody was in favor of Sabbath, and we all found it rather difficult to do. Someone mentioned that Sabbath is great until you start thinking about what the parking lot at ShopRite's going to be like when you're done with your Sabbath.
Yep.
Yeah, we spent a fair amount of time just talking about what the word actually means and doing a little research as to, and we talked about how it is the seventh day, how it means rest. Most, technically, and also some of this, and so what is it that we are called to do on Sabbath? And that it is just, no, it is more, we think, than rest. It is spending time with our with our relationship with God, and we also and then we, as you did, discuss some of, is that solitary, or does it by definition require a community element? So yeah.
Also did not come up with a conclusion.
Right. It's interesting when you said it's the seventh day, because if you look at other religions, they have the seventh day, but it's not the same seventh day that we have. So how do you count it, and what makes the way you count it right? Because, in Jewish traditions, it's Saturday. In Muslim, I think it's Monday.
It's Friday.
And so it's, you could have a 3-day weekend all the time if you wanted to practice all the religions. So it's sort of.
I think, yeah, we also talked about it as, there's the historical, well, at least of US culture, 1900 and the 1800s, where it was the whole day and you did nothing and you didn't bake and you didn't cook, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But more metaphorically in the 21st century, is it, does it have to be a whole day? Does it have to be Sunday? Is it really more of a spiritual practice and a heart attitude, irrespective of the absolute hours devoted to it, or where those hours are placed?
Ching-Fen, I'm curious if in Taiwan they're any better at practicing Sabbath than we are here.
Very hard to say. When I was growing up, the Christian population is only 1/2 of 1%.
Oh.
And the rest of the society, even though they have a 1 day off, but it's a double work day. You say the regular work you could not do, you wait until that day to do. That's
Yeah.
it's a different kind of a concept. But I found that, for me, my family, on Saturday, on Sunday, Sabbath day, we are not allowed even to study, and everything quiet down. It's worship in the afternoon. We have two worships, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and then we'll go to visit someone shut-ins or someone who are in hospital or something could not come. And it has been like I grew up in that kind of a system or a pattern of life. So I don't feel anything particular when I, move out to this country. I had to write my paper, and I had to spend 3 times more than regular student in order to finish my my homework. That's a totally different language. So I had to do it. Anyway, I think that for Christian it is important. It's a sign of difference between a Christian and the non-believers. The Christian will observe at least one day in a week, devoted that to worship and to cultivate their relationship with God and human other and neighbors.
Rick, what about some of the other questions that were up here?
We also talked about just what military consumerism is and whether we could relate that phrase, which Brueggemann just kind of throws out a couple of times, whether we could relate that concept to the idea that we talked about last week of systemic sin. That if military consumerism is in fact the basis of the North American economies, is that systemic sin? And Sabbath. And then we started talking towards the end, and this is when we got the button saying return to meeting. We started talking about how to align our understandings of community concerns with the concerns of the community, where the church's notions of what needs to be done overlap and coincide with the community's notions of what needs to be done. Anybody want to say anything about military consumerism?
We had an interesting discussion about it too, because I felt that I needed some definition around it, and we had a good discussion, and Gerald kind of explained part of it, and we had a general discussion, just that our choices as a nation to expend so much money on defense, and also to just have so much of the economy based around selling arms and selling things in general. It does, it represents a choice that stops us from doing other things that we might do with that money, or frankly even just with our time. I think just not expending so much thought and effort on some of those issues would allow us to spend more time on.
Someone in our group pointed out that we actually assume and operate on the assumption that our relationships with other peoples and other nations will be based ultimately in a military relationship. That the first thing that we do when we deal with other countries is we start talking about arms deals. Pretty powerful example.
And in the United States, we have to be number one. That's the other thing. I think we have to be the protector of the world and the governor of the world, or the governance of the world, because we are the best and we know what to do and we are always right. And so we have all these arms so that we can protect ourselves and sell things to other people too. But if we don't have all these arms, we can't protect ourselves, and then we won't be number one.
Mm, mm.
Such a burdensome self-concept, though. It's
And I think it's also, it's more than that of having all these arms. It's all the backdoor deals that go on with who knows who that wants what. So we'll give you a contract. We really don't need this, but we'll give you a contract to build all this stuff. And, you know, we'll use it eventually. And thank you for helping us look powerful in the world.
Well, and when you look at the gospel and what it says, and this is, I think, where Bruggeman is, trying to get us, as he said, to unentwine, right, the Western exceptionalism from what the gospel actually says, to have so much of our financial well-being as a society, at least economic, or GDP, based on weapons of destruction and death, is really in contrast to what the gospel is saying, calling us to do.
Mm-hmm.
Any other, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that so then you kind of ask yourself, okay, but what do other countries, how is it different? Other countries have military, even, and Gerald, we didn't carry a follow up on this, but even so-called neutral country, well, not so-called, even neutral countries like Switzerland have a military and very proud of their military, in fact. But it doesn't dominate their economy in the same way that it does in the US. And I think, and that point about the worldview is important to bring up too.
It's hard to give up something that you feel like you're really good at. And the United States feels they're very good at military, building, product, weapons, so forth, and to decide to give that up to do something else would be a huge step.
And to not be dominant is a big change.
Yeah.
I think this country now defined its greatness in its military power, and the capitalism that derived out of this military industry.
Mm-hmm.
We also have 5 military academies that graduate the best and the brightest and the smartest to continue to lead our armies to be the best, the brightest, and the smartest.
It's going to take a lot of church work to pull this apart. Are you guys ready?
yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's
Think
kind
they're
of
listening.
interesting because, we have such a huge military complex that paradoxically, it is also the institution that, brought about a lot of desegregation.
It did.
It's a primary, we've turned this, as opposed to, other ways to accomplish poverty reduction. We use our military for education, for poverty reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could look at it the other way.
They can't hear you.
You could look at it the other way. I think the American culture is built, to raise basically people, poor people, to go into the army. I mean, if you listen to a lot of people, who are studying, you're talking about seeing white or the concept of patriarchism, a lot of that is basically meant to guide men to be willing to go to war, and especially poorer men, because, you know, they don't have a choice.
Mhm.
So it's, then by definition, there are a lot of them, and you have to do things to take care of them. You know, it's like the Romans who used to get a farm when they come back. So it was the poor people who were in the Roman army, but they had good reason to do that. And I think, you know, to me, as we're talking, I think about, you know, what happened with France. You know, we used to have a huge colonial empire, and we used to have, you know, troops and boat and ships and planes and everything in countries all over the world, especially in Africa, but Vietnam, and which was then called, well, it was called Vietnam already, I guess, Indochina.
to China.
You know, we went through that, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s to realize that the army had to shrink. We had no more colonies. We had nowhere to send them. We had to shrink it. We had to, you know, realize we were a smaller, much smaller country than what we thought. I think that's where the US is going in the near future.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I sometimes I see this ad, you know, on TV ad saying join the army and see the world, join the, you know, Navy to see the world, and so that means you look at the whole world with the military eyes, you know, to be a military person to know the world, you know, and so I think, you know, that's in our psyche, you know, in our soul.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, I don't know how it is in America, but I know in Canada, if you join the military, you get your education paid for. So there's a very close parallel between getting out of poverty through education and then serving your country. Like you,
Oh, really?
Well,
yeah,
they do have the GI bill
that's
here as
true
well.
here too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, I want to honor some of the instincts that are behind the things that we're talking about. You know, I don't disagree with what I've heard, and I think it's a really interesting perspective that a lot of our culture is set up to attract people into some sort of military work on behalf of the nation, so to speak.
Specifically poor people.
Well, specifically poor people, but yeah, but that is true. But I just think there's a real question between is it all just a lure and a sham to trap poor people into this thing, or has it in fact been an engine of some degree of equalization and economic equalization, and I think there's a pretty good case to be made that it has, but that doesn't mean that it's the right way to keep going, and it doesn't mean that we need an army of this size, you know, a military of this size. It doesn't mean that we need to expend the kind of money we do on the military. I just want to say that I don't know that I would go as far as to say that it was, you know, all a deliberate scam kind of thing. I'm not saying anyone said that, but I feel like it is a problem. It is a problem for our nation, and especially our attitude about ourselves, as has been said in quite a few different good ways tonight. The idea that we're the saviors of the world, or we're the protectors of the world, or any of that, you know, it's foolish in a sense, but it has also been true in a sense for some period of time.
Right.
And so figuring out how do you work your way out of that, that's a big task. I think it's a really an important one. Yeah.
You know, I came to the US in large part because, believe it or not, from my place in France, I supported the Vietnam War, and I was um, impressed that the United States was the only country willing to stand up to communism. And that's because I knew French military officers who had been prisoners of the Viet Minh after the war, and who would tell me what they thought of communism and all of that. And so I totally, agree with what you say. To many people, the U.S. has been, their savior. Certainly, the French and the liberation and all of that. On the other hand, just like I was saying, I went to the very best military school in France. I was an officer in the French Navy, but nobody from that school goes into the military once they've completed their, it's like 5% of them stay in the military. Everybody else goes into business. And the contrast between that and, West Point and Annapolis and all of these things where, people do end up in business, but often after 20, 30 years in the armed forces, it's very, very different.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's
I think we're going to have to leave it there, guys. We're getting beyond time, and our 1 hour Zoom brain is starting to zoom out on us. Just a reminder, we are not gathering next week because it's election day.
So
but
there's an election next week, huh?
There's an election. I think most of us have already voted.
Yeah.
Has there been any update about the evening prayer session where it's going to be, Bets?
No.
Okay.
So we'll see you in 2 weeks. Watch for the email, and we will be called to hope next week.
Call to hope.
Okay.
So thank you for joining, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.